Hello, today is April 4th, 2007. We're at the home of Mr. Harold Scatterday Jr. at his home in Windsor, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans Oral History Project. Welcome, Mr. Scatterday, and thank you for participating in this project.
Thank you for doing this.
You bet. Let's start out, if we can. If you can tell us a little bit about yourself, particularly when and where you were born.
I was born June 3rd, 1925, near Saguache, Colorado, on my grandparents' ranch.
And where generally is Saguache, Colorado?
It's on the west edge of the San Luis Valley, southwest central Colorado. And at the age of 2, my father was transferred from the mine. There was CF&I, the steel company in Pueblo. And he was transferred to the main office in Pueblo, Colorado, and that's where I then lived until I went into the service and went through high school and everything there.
Did you have any other siblings?
No, I was an only child.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were doing prior to entering the service?
I graduated from Pueblo Central. I was in the midst of the first year of Pueblo Junior College when I was drafted into the service. And that was on the September the 11th, which seems to be a kind of a noted day for me. Later on...
September 11th of what year?
Of 1944.
Okay.
And September the 11th of 1945, I had 2 days, 2 September the 11th, because I went across the international date line.
Do you remember where you were and what you were thinking when you heard that Pearl Harbor had been bombed?
Yes, I do remember. I was laying on my stomach on Sunday morning, listening to the radio, as if I were watching television, but there wasn't any then. And I can remember that, and I can remember my mother saying, well, you don't have to worry, you're only 16, so,
Worry that in the sense that the war would be over
That's
before?
Right, the war would be over by that time.
Yeah.
But that didn't quite wear that out, but thanks to the good Lord, I made it back without a scratch.
So you were drafted in, you said 44?
Yes.
Into the U.S. Army?
Right.
Where did you go for your basic training?
I took my basic training in Camp Roberts, California, and we were pulled off of bivouac a little bit early because they thought they were going to need us for the Battle of the Bulge in Europe. Mm. But by the time we got our shots and everything and oriented, they had broken through, so they decided to go ahead and send us home for the 11 days delay en route, and instead of going to Fort Dix in the east coast, we went to Fort Ord on the west coast, and then up to Fort Lawton, Washington, and we shipped out of Fort Lawton, Washington, then when we went overseas.
Do you remember when you what it was like when you left Pueblo to go off to the service? Did your folks see you to the station, or do you remember that day?
Yes, and they were very supportive all the way. In fact, my father, there were 5 of us from Colorado that kind of stuck together. And Fort Ord, that we were just before we were ready to ship out, my father drove out and took us all to lunch.
Is that right?
And so it was nice. And 4 out of the 5 of us were able to come home. And it's funny. This I guess people understand and they realize this, but one of my buddies was Louis Hurd. His father owned the Hurd Pontiac agency in Pueblo, and he was sitting right across the table from my father, and my dad said, Louis, what are you going to do after the service? You're going to go in business with your father in the automobile business? And without changing his expression at all, he said, no, Mr. Scatterday, he said, I'm not coming back. And sure enough, he and I were together until just the invasion of Okinawa, and we were split up on Saipan he went into the 96th and I went into the 77th. And I had written him a letter on board ship before the invasion. And about 9 days later, I got it back marked deceased, and that was kind of a shock.
Wow. Wow. In your basic training, were you put into a specialty?
It was just infantry
just
training.
Infantry?
General infantry training, primarily weapons and map reading and things like that.
Uh-huh. And so from Fort Ord you shipped out, or you went up to?
We went up to Fort Lawton by troop train from Fort Ord, California, to Fort Lawton, Washington. We shipped out of Seattle on the 11th of February in '44.
Was the change from civilian life to military life, what was that like for you?
Well, I had had 3 years of high school ROTC, so I was fairly familiar with the military part of it, but, so it wasn't all that different. But of course, being in a structured environment in the Army is different than civilian life for sure.
Yeah. As you shipped out, did they prepare you for what? I'm sure you'd got news on the fighting and such in the Pacific and how vicious the fighting was. Had they prepared you as to what to expect, what the Japanese were like? How was?
Well, there was a little of that introduced all the way through. The thing that I really remember before we shipped out up in Seattle there, we were made to go into this swimming pool, fully dressed in combat with a backpack and so forth, and jump off of a 10-foot diving board. And we had to swim at least 30 feet because they felt that, if we were on board ship that got down, we should be able to swim at least 30 feet so we wouldn't get drawn on with the ship. And but then we went from there to Hawaii, and we had jungle training and amphibious training there, and then on into Saipan for the preparation for the invasion of Okinawa.
What was it? What was the crossing like from Hawaii? I mean, coming from southern Colorado, I don't know if you'd ever been to the sea or even been on a boat. What was your?
I had been on a boat. However, the first, I was on 9 different ships all the time in my service, and I only got seasick twice, and that was the first 3 days out of Seattle and the last 3 days into San Francisco. On our way back, the ground swells on the west coast are horrible. In fact, just after they dropped the bomb and we were going from the Philippines up to the northernmost island of Japan, where we did our occupation, we hit the edge of a typhoon, and we were looking up at 40 and 50-foot waves, and we didn't get sick there. But the first 3 days off the coast of California, even the sailors were sick that day.
So after your training in Hawaii, you said you headed for Saipan.
Yes.
Did you know did they inform you what was in store, or was it?
Well, we knew where we were going, sure. And kind of a disconcerting thing about this, we had, when we loaded aboard the ship for the invasion of Okinawa, Tokyo rose from information from the Japs that were still in the caves on the island of Saipan, told us what ships we were on, the infantry outfits, numbers and everything, and the number of people that were in, and where we were going, when we were expected, and she said, "I'm sure sorry." So that was a little rough.
Wow, that must have been kind of hard.
She was working on your mind.
Yeah. So Saipan was more or less just the staging area to prepare for,
yes.
And then how long is it from Saipan to ship to Okinawa then?
As I remember, it was just about 7 days. But that was odd too. You talk about the calm before the storm. The last 2 days before we got into Okinawa, the sea was just as smooth as glass, and all you could see was the white foam from the ships that were going through. So it was very, very calm.
In the calm before the storm, what's it like? What are you thinking? How do you prepare yourself when you know you're going into battle and the dangers that may lie ahead, the uncertainty? Do you remember what you were thinking and how you prepared yourself for that?
No, I really don't. It was, you knew about what it was going to be like, but there's nothing that they could tell you or anything else that would prepare you for that.
Yeah. Okay, so you're approaching up on Okinawa. Can you walk us through the invasion and your?
We were ready to go ashore on the one side of the ship on the cargo nets, and we had a kamikaze plane hit the other side of the ship, and it wiped out our headquarters company. And but we got on the amphibs then for the landing, and there was very little resistance until we got into the center of the island. And then we split and went to the south, and the 77th Infantry was in between the 1st and the 6th Marines, and we went through the complete south end of the island.
And that's where all the fighting was on the south end, correct? Yeah.
Most of it. Yeah, the 7th and the 27th were on the north end, and they didn't get much either. But what we found when we got to the south end of the island was that, of course, they had had years to prepare for this, and they had complete cities underground. They had hospitals and ammo dumps, supply dumps, everything underground. And of course, part of the Okinawan history, the burial of their dead were in caves, and they were designed like a female womb, like they were taking the deceased and putting them back in the ground. And we would be going across in an area, and we would throw smoke satchel charges in the openings, and it wasn't very long until you could see puffs of smoke coming out on the various sides of the island, or the mountains, so you knew you were being watched, but you didn't know by who or what. So it was that was kind of rough.
What were conditions like as far as I guess the weather and your sleeping conditions, the food, and just the stress of, like you just said, you're being watched.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about all of that?
Well, getting for about the first 3 weeks that we were up on the lines, Okinawa is much the same latitude and everything as Denver is, for instance. And it was their rainy season, and we were going through mud that was a foot deep, getting it up in there. And of course they were you were sleeping in foxholes, and I was a bazooka man, so I never knew which end of the line I was going to be on. If we would stop at night, I was put wherever they thought there might be a chance of Japanese tanks coming through the lines. And one thing on Okinawa, our orders were that nobody moved after dark. Anything that moved got shot. And we would have, there's something in the stress of that. It's funny, things that happen that you can laugh about.
now or then as well?
Well, then as
Yeah.
then as what much as now. But this one night I happened to be in Foxhole with a young man by the name of Sampson. He was from Utah. In the Army, you're always together with people alphabetical order. So I was with all the S's. And so about every 3 minutes, why they would shoot up a flare that would come to the ground on a little parachute. And you didn't dare move, because if you moved, why, it caused a shadow and they could see where you were. But you would sit there and just move your eyes to tell whether there was anybody out in front of you or not. And the Japanese had, they would not let the Okinawan people through the lines during the day. They would come in, force them to come in through at night, and so consequently there was some of them that were lost. But this one night that I'll never forget, it was pitch black, and we thought we heard something out in front, and this kid, Sampson, said, "Shall we throw a grenade?" And I said, "No, let's wait till the next flare goes off and see," because we had a pretty good view in front of the hole. And so the flare went off, and we were able to tell that there was no one out there that we could see. And so the flare burned out and everything, and so pretty soon I noticed him going on the bottom of the foxhole with his hand like this, and I whispered, "What are you doing?" And he was trying to find the pin for the grenade. He had pulled the grenade, and he was all this time sitting there holding it. If he had dozed off or anything, we'd have been in trouble. But it's something like that, you know, at the time seems a little bit funny. And but as we got closer to the south end of the island, we ran into, you know, everybody thinks that the Japanese were fairly small people. The closer we got to the south end of the island, we ran into the Imperial Japanese Marines, and they were all 6 foot or better.
Really?
And another happened to be in the foxhole with a buddy of mine that was the company cook. And so our foxhole was right at the top of the hill, and there was a path leading up to the top. And one flare went off, light, and here, standing right over our foxhole, was a Japanese soldier. And of course, it was as much of a shock to him as it was to us, and he wheeled around and took off immediately. But it's things you remember.
Yeah. Oh, geez. How were conditions? I mean, being out in the elements for, I would imagine, weeks on end. Did you get enough sleep? And particularly in stressful conditions like that, with flares going off all night, were you able to? Do you feel like you got enough sleep?
Oh, you've got the adrenaline going. You really don't need an awful lot of sleep. You don't get a lot. And invariably, every foxhole I ever dug, I think, had a rock right in the middle, so it wasn't your posture-beating mattress for sure.
And can you talk a little bit about the battle conditions? I mean, for somebody like myself that has no concept of what it's like to be in battle, how did you deal with the stress of it? How did you keep going? I mean, with a lot of things going against you, such as the stress and the conditions and weather and such, what kept you going?
I don't know. It's just adrenaline, I guess. I know we got in one position where the 6th Marines on our right were so anxious to take this one hill that they left a pocket of Japanese in one of the burial caves behind us. And we made the top of the hill next to them, and the Japanese came out behind us and proceeded to pick us off one at a time with their knee mortars, which they were very good at. And a company of infantry is about 160 men, and I was one of 16 that were able to walk. They were all not casualties as far as being killed, but I was one of 16 that could walk off that mountain.
Wow.
So I'm very blessed. There were a couple times when we were forced to go across a large expanse of open area, and they decided to do that after dark. Of course, everybody had the password was wonderful pickle, and the Japanese could not pronounce that. So you knew, even though they might know wonderful pickle, that couldn't say it right.
Yeah, right. The L's.
And but we were going across this expanse that was pretty well exposed, you know, where they could see us if it had been daylight. And I know there was a fellow that dodged in front of me to miss a shell hole, and he got right in front of me and got hit, so that that bullet had my name on it, but he took it for me.
Wow. What was it like then? Once you got off the line or went back for an R&R, did that all, the adrenaline and everything, catch up to you? What was it like to decompress from something like that?
We were pulled back for one period of time, and I think what we were more impressed by was the fact that, of course, we had had sea rations all the time up there and everything, and they might make it up there with what they called a Marmite can. It was a big insulated can, like a thermos can, with coffee at night. And we had, I don't know why we ever called it this, but a washing machine Charlie, just about dusk. They would have mortar shells, and they'd fire 5 of them. One always seemed to be a little too far. One was a little short. One was a little to the right. One was a little to the left. Watch out for the 5th one. And they had just brought up, we had gotten our 5, and they just brought up the Marmite can with coffee and put it in a shell hole. And for some reason they changed their procedure, and they sent a 6th one. And so I was over there with the lid off the coffee just in time to have one hit and get mud. And I was not the favorite person at that time. So, but those are the things that you remember, and some of them you remember with a laugh, and some of them you remember with tears in your eyes.
Yeah, particularly the ones with the tears in your eyes. How was it dealing with watching your fellow soldiers? You said you were one of 16 out of 160 that didn't get killed or injured. Yeah. It must have been tough to see your friends getting killed and injured. And
I don't know. As a bazooka man, I was in different foxholes, so I might not have been with my real close buddies. But I got pinned down one time with 3 others, and I was the only one of the 4 that made it out.
Wow. How long was the fighting on Okinawa?
From the 1st of April, they pulled us back as we got close to the south end of the island. They pulled us back in supporting fire for the 1st and 6th Marines, but one area, our recon our air recon. Of course, we had air supremacy at that point. And they advised us they were forming for one last push, a bonsai attack. And they were forming in an area that was about 1,000 yards square. Well, we had 35 battalions of artillery behind us, plus the narrowness of the island. We had naval guns coming in from both sides. And on a given signal, they all let loose on this 1,000 yard square. And we walked over it about 3 days later, and there was not a whole human being in the whole thing.
Wow. And then once the fighting was over in Okinawa, where did you go?
They pulled us back, and there's where the 16 came in. They had made arrangements for a full company. They didn't know, of course, to board an LST to go to Cebu in the Philippines. And so the 16 of us kind of lived high in CPO's quarters, so forth. And but I found out what the Navy did because, of course, I was kind of walking the ship. You couldn't sleep very much. And this one Navy man said, "Sergeant, would you like a cup of coffee?" And I said, "Well, thank you." So we stood there, and he poured me the thickest coffee I have ever drank. You could cut it with a pair of scissors. But then we were in Lady Harbor the 4th of July in 45. And then we went into Cebu, which is a long, narrow island right in the middle of the group of Philippine islands. And we replaced the, pardon me, 32nd Infantry. And we had to make our own camp out of they gave us a kind of a bog. So we hauled, we had 3 teams, 24 hours hauling sand from the beach up to fill up so we could put our tents up. And but there were still pockets of foreign troops in the island, and we'd take sorties up to, if we'd get information that they'd run into a pocket or something like that.
Now, the 16 of you, were you still part of the 77th, or were you formed
yes.
into another?
No, we were in the 77th.
And did they send replacements to?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay, okay.
And we got most of our replacements in Cebu, and some of them, in fact, I've gotten letters from members of the 77th that had been wounded in several of the islands. They were in, I can't name them, but in fighting down there, and in the Philippines, they went in on one of the islands there. And some of them that had been wounded and had taken on a hospital ship and brought back to active duty, and they joined us again there in Cebu. And we were loading. We already had our orders for the invasion of Tokyo, and we were to do exactly the same thing that we did between the 1st and 6th Marines. And we were just about half, we had the troop carrier about half loaded with the ammunition and gas and so forth, and we had a tank battalion attached to us. And we were, like I say, we were about half loaded when they dropped the bomb. And we continued loading. In fact, they took that ship and everything on up to Hokkaido, where we were stationed.
You remember hearing about the bomb, and I imagine it was a few days later before you got all the
Yes.
details. But
Yeah.
could you fathom what this thing was?
No,
Yeah.
in no way. We had nothing that was even close to that, of course. We had, I might remember one thing there during the fighting on Okinawa. You've heard the term friendly fire. We got caught. They zeroed in on the wrong hill, and we got caught by our own timed white phosphorus fire, artillery fire. And I can remember this dear friend of mine. I lost him just about 2 years ago. He was from Kremlin, and dear friend. And I came down the trail after we got hit by that, and he had phosphorus on, and he went like this, of course, which was the worst thing he could do because he got it on his, not only on his arm, but he's on his hand. And I got a piece on my backpack, and I was just able to get the backpack off as it burned through the last layer of canvas.
Oh.
And that's it's a rough way to go.
Yeah. Well, there's been, getting back to dropping the bomb. You know, there's been over the years. There's been the controversy that we shouldn't have versus we should have dropped the bomb. You want to weigh in on your thoughts, being a person that would have been involved with the invasion?
I can tell you that I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you, and it would have been a tremendous loss of life, both Army and because their orders were to fight to the death, even their citizens in Japan, and it would have been very, very serious. And one of the, even though the war was over, one of the most stressful things, we unloaded at Otaru, which is on the island of Hokkaido. It's on the west side.
So at this point, you'd started up as part of the
occupation
force.
And we had gotten, we had unloaded, and there was one Japanese person on the dock. They loaded us in 6x6s, and we went from there. We had to drive something like 65 miles, I think it was.
What's a 6x6?
That's a large Army truck.
Oh, okay.
Which has duals in the back end, and of course 4-wheel drive. And in fact, I think 6x6 indicates that all three are in operation.
Yeah.
And but we were all sitting there in the back of the open trucks with your rifle in front of you. And we went the full 65 miles to Sapporo, which is the capital city, and we were to be housed in old infantry, Japanese infantry barracks. We went through little towns where the houses were right next to the street. You didn't see a soul. All of the windows were boarded and shuttered and everything. You knew you were being watched, but you didn't know by who or anything. And it was a good, 3 weeks to 30 days before people started to come out, one little at a time, because they had all been told that we were there to rape and pillage and everything else. And that was odd because you really didn't know what was going on.
Right, sure. Sure, it must have been an eerie, sort of
It
eerie
was
sight,
eerie.
feeling. Yeah. I want to back up real quick,
Sure.
and I'll go.
Sure.
We'll go ahead. But do you remember, after the bomb was dropped, and a few days later, VJ Day? You remember where you were on VJ Day, and what the atmosphere was like when you heard that Japan had officially surrendered?
Yes, we were still on the island of Cebu, and there again, the only thing we did was you heard it on the radio,
Mm-hmm.
and of course we had heard that they were planning the ceremonies in Tokyo Bay and everything, and so we had our ear on the radio to hear, and I'll tell you what, it was nothing but joy, really.
It must have been a wonderful feeling after all you'd been through to know that you'd survived the war. And,
having been through it,
yeah,
we certainly were not looking forward to going any further.
yeah, yeah. Okay, and now back, we'll go ahead again back on the island. You said that the civilians started slowly coming out. After they started coming out, did you have much interaction with civilians at all, or?
They warmed up, when they found out that we weren't there to do them any harm. And I got transferred or not transferred, but put in charge of a detail getting coal out of the center of the island to ship down to 8th Army headquarters in Tokyo. And there were 7 of us, and I probably had closer contact with the superintendent of the mine, for instance, and the other people up there. We had our own, we were housed in miners' quarters, and we were provided a cook, and we slept on rice mats, and we had maids that kept our rooms clean and everything. And I became very good friends with the mine superintendent, who was a graduate of Washington State University.
Huh.
Spoke just as good English as I did. And he had me over to the house several times, and for dinner, so I got to experience a Japanese dinner. And he had an older daughter, and she sat behind me and to my left, and his wife sat behind him and to his left. And that was the first place that I learned that you never drink sake, the whole thing, at once. It's like it's not very large amount,
Yeah.
It's a small shot glass and everything. But the minute it's empty, they fill it. And so I learned very quick that I didn't go any further. But it was very, very interesting, and I often wish that I had kind of kept in touch with them.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how your thought towards the Japanese people changed or didn't change from the fighting to being into that home to now? Was there a difference in opinion, or did you ever?
I don't think the only experience, the mine superintendent had a young son, and he didn't take to me very, very well. Now the older daughter and I became very, very good friends. But you could tell that he harbored a lot of resentment, and I don't think we did. It was odd, of course. The mine superintendent and the mine owner had to clear with me anything they did to the mine, and which, I didn't have experience or anything else in that. We had a shovel operator, a bulldozer operator, 2 truck drivers, had our own cook, which he didn't do anything but sit around and make well, we got our staples once every 2 weeks. And he always had a big can of either peaches or apricots. And the next day you found them in a Jeep can behind the stove with a little bit of yeast and sugar and everything else. And we always knew when it was ready to sample, because he'd bake bread and then he'd filter it through the bread, and it came out just as clear and sweet as, I mean, you might take a sip now and then, but you didn't drink much of it. But no, the people up there were very, very nice. I had my first shave by a female Japanese barber, and gave me one of the best haircuts I ever had. And you know, you kind of wonder, there she is holding a
Straight edge?
Straight edge. But no, they were very, very nice.
Yeah.
Once they found out that we were there to coexist, that we weren't there to harm them in any way, why, they were very, very nice.
Now, was that your responsibility through your whole time in the occupation force? And how long were you in the occupation force? How long were you there in Japan?
We landed the 6th of October, and it was about the 10th of May. Our infantry outfit had been deactivated, and I lacked 11 points of going home with my group. And those of us that were non-commissioned officers were transferred to Tokyo and attached to the 5th Air Force. Incidentally, that was the first time we had sheets in 2 years.
Wow.
And anybody PFC and under were attached to the 1st Cavalry in Tokyo. And we lived when we first got there, we stayed in the Kaijo building, which was right across the street and across the moat from the Imperial Palace.
Oh, wow.
And it was about, as I remember, 6 or 8 stories high, and we'd go up on the roof and you could look down into the gardens and everything. And then right across the street was the USO, and there's where we got all our coffee and donuts.
Mm-hmm. Mm. What was the scene like in where you were up in your first assignment in Tokyo? Was there a lot of destruction? What was the scene of the area?
I've got pictures that I can show you of Tokyo itself. Now, the building that we were in had been untouched.
Probably because it was so close to the palace.
However, on the other side, the building of equal size, all it was a basement. They had cleared it out. And the depot was just nothing but rubble. And there were parts of downtown, of the center part of Tokyo, that had not been touched. For instance, there was a theater in the Ginza district was pretty much intact, and they had like an auditorium, and we went to several events there, like the Royal Japanese Ballet and everything. And one of the real nice things when we got down there, we would get up in the morning, and as long as we stood relatively, then we were informed whether or not we had been assigned that day. If we hadn't been assigned, we were free to walk over and see the entire city.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd get a 2-day pass, maybe something like that, and we saw the Mikimoto Pearl Farm, for instance, and the big Buddha, and we had an R&R at the Atami Recreation Center, and things like that were beautiful. Of course, we had a beautiful view of Mount Fuji, and because there weren't any buildings high enough to block your view.
Let me back up, I guess, as a question throughout your whole experience, as far as communications back and forth to home. Were you able to write back and forth pretty consistently?
Oh, yeah.
Was mail getting to you consistently?
Yeah, I wrote my mother every day, except the days when we didn't have that we were on Okinawa. But,
yeah.
And I got mail from her. I might get 3 or 4 at a time.
Yeah.
But I'll never forget this. My grandmother, in whose home I was born, in Saguache, was a tremendous cook, and she sent me a box of peanut butter cookies. By the time I got them, they were just like cereal, so I got milk and ate them that way. But it was something.
Did through these letters from your mom, or once you got back home, did she ever talk about how she dealt with you being overseas and not probably through not being able to know exactly where you were and just the uncertainty of you being in harm's way? Did she ever talk about how she dealt with that, or?
I kind of got around that. My dad and I had a code, and I would start every sentence, and if you read down, you'd know exactly where I was. And before we left, before we shipped over, a very dear friend of my parents, he was in the engineers. He was a civil engineer there in Pueblo. And the last time we heard, he was on Saipan. And so when we got there, I wrote my folks and I said, well, I saw Cy Elliott today.
As the code that you were on Saipan.
So they knew where I was.
Did you ever run into anybody from home in your travels that
I did
stumble across anybody?
In fact, 2 nights before the invasion, I was standing on the edge of the ship, looking out, watching the waves and everything. And this soldier came up with his hand on and he said, "You're Harold Scatterday, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I was a year behind you in high school." And so I don't know what happened to him after that. That was the last I saw of him.
And what about your 5 buddies that you more or less took off with from Colorado and through boot camp? What? Of course, you said you lost one of your friends.
Yeah, most of them. The next time I saw them was in Camp Beale, California, when we were separated after we had gotten home.
So you returned home in May of '46 then, or you were released from the service, or?
No, I returned in September of '46, and we were given leave because we had unused time to spend before we could be separated, and my pardon me, my honorable discharge did not come through until the 25th of November, and I was home by that time because my parents came out and met me at Camp Beale, and
what was that reunion like?
That was something. We, of course, were on the post, and my folks had gotten a motel there in Marysville, I think was the name of the little town next to it. And so I had gotten the pass, and my folks, my dad had almost like a twin brother that lived in Los Angeles. He was the chief architect for Union Pacific Railroad. He had charge of all their construction from Omaha west to the west coast. And so we spent a couple of days down there and drove down there. But the morning that I went over to the motel, I walked in, and of course my mother and I were there, and the lady at the motel said to my mother, she said, "I'll bet you're very happy to have your husband home from overseas." And about that time my dad walked in and he said, "Who the hell do you think I am?" Yeah, he was something else.
So did you return back to Pueblo with them, or did you return later on?
At that time, they were living in Denver. They
Oh, okay.
My father had he discussed this with me before I went into the service. He had been with CF&I for 20-some odd years, and he said that one day he said, "You know, I've gone as far as I can without waiting for someone to die." And he and our next-door neighbor had a chance to go in, and that's when they started the lumber business.
Okay, okay.
And they had moved to, they had an apartment in Denver and one in Glenwood. They had purchased 2 sawmills up on top of what they called Klein Top, which was north of Rifle. And they spent about half their time in Denver, and then they their production of the sawmills got so good that they had to find a retail outlet, and that's when they started the lumberyard there in Denver.
Gotcha.
Lakewood.
Okay. So you're discharged and you return to Colorado. What did you take some downtime between starting off with a new venture, or what did you do after you got home?
I started right back with my education. I was going to at that time be a civil engineer.
Mm-hmm.
So my first 2 years at CU in downtown Denver, and I was delivering for my dad in the lumber business. And so after...
Were you able to take advantage of the GI Bill?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, okay. Uh-huh.
Yes, and I had, as I say, 2 years of basic engineering at CU, and my dad sat me down one day and he said, "You know, someday this is going to be yours." He said, "You might try and get something a little closer to it." And that's when I transferred over to the architectural school at DU, and that's where I graduated in '51.
Gotcha. Okay. Once again, the counter side to the question I asked earlier, was it hard to transition from the military life and all you'd been through back into the civilian life? What was that transition like for you?
No, I fit right in.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I really didn't have a chance to see what Army life was like in the United States, because I was just through my basic training and immediately went overseas, came back, and Camp Beale right off the boat, and then I was discharged.
Yeah.
So my Army experience was all overseas, you might say.
Was it hard to leave behind your war experience, though, and transition into the quiet civilian life, all that you'd been through? Was that, were you able to block that out, or did that?
It was easy to block out.
Yeah, yeah.
Easy for me. Some people that had it rougher than I, you know, might have had a harder time getting through it. But I had a lot of support from the family, and I was just lucky all the way around.
Mm-hmm. And then you went on once you got your degree, you went to work for your father, or did you go off and do architecture?
I've still been. I did all the I was residential architect, and I did that right with the lumberyard. And in other words, if they purchased the materials from us, why we furnished their plans.
Gotcha.
And it was I had the pleasure of hearing from my father that it had been a real advantage to have me
Yeah.
on board.
Oh, wonderful. And talk a little bit about your family. When did you meet your wife and get married, and your children? And
My wife and I have been married 52 years. We have 2 children, one boy and one girl. And we have a fairly small family, really. Only one grandchild, our grandson. He lives in Johnstown, married with our 2 pride and joy great-grandchildren up right next to the door up there. And they're at the present time 5.5 and 3.5. And our daughter's red-headed, and the little great-granddaughter is also red-headed. My wife and I always say when we see a young couple walking down the street with a red-headed girl, we'd say, well, shall we tell them now or have them wait and find out on their own?
Through the years, have you kept in touch with any of your war buddies, or gone to any reunions, or joined any organizations along that line?
Yes, I was fortunate to have one reunion, and that was in 1991, and this very, very close buddy, and his name was Bob Shea. We called him Shorty Shea because we had another buddy that was former county commissioner out at Burlington. He was 6'2", and Shorty was about 5'6" on a good day, you know. And they were walking around like this all the time. Yeah, Shorty and I had something special. I don't know, several times. As I say, they were from Kremling. And
Okay.
I can remember one day I got up and went to work at the lumber yard, and I don't know what it was, but that morning when I got up, I thought about Shorty, that I ought to get in touch with him. And a little later that morning, I had to go up to Target, which is not too far away, to pick up something. I don't know what it was, but as I do, if I'm going to go, I go in and get it and walk back out.
Yeah.
And so I had just turned around, and who the other, coming down the other end of the aisle was Shorty Shea.
Oh, be darned.
And but he and I did have a bond. That he was just before we found out that he had cancer. For some reason, I had again a couple of the pictures that I had there. I had taken copies of them and sent them over, and said, "What does this remind you of?" You know, and I called and talked to Vera, his wife, that day, and I said, "How's everything in the Kremlin?" And she said, "Well, not too well." She said, "We just found out that Shorty has cancer."
Mm.
And that was a rough one. We lost him.
Yeah.
Here about 6 months ago, I was trying to get a hold of my old first sergeant. He lived in Jacksonville, Illinois. His name was Bernie Shanahan. Neat fella. And I called back there, and he had passed away about 5 years ago.
Hmm.
And but I have since heard from a couple of others that I got a letter from a fellow from Company G that I didn't remember. But he had sent me a copy of we were in Sapporo, Hokkaido for Christmas of '46, and or Christmas of '45 it was. I'm sorry, and they had made up a menu for the Christmas dinner, and he sent me a copy of that, which I had someplace, but I had forgotten about it.
Uh-huh.
But it was nice, and that kind of spurred me on to contact. We have another fellow from Minden, Nebraska, that he and I were fairly close.
Have you had a chance at all to travel back overseas to, be it Saipan or Okinawa or Japan?
I haven't.
No.
We were in Hawaii. My wife and I spent 3 weeks there in '75. I planned it with spending a little bit more on Oahu because that's the island that we were on. I would do it differently now, but because Oahu is just a big island. Honolulu is another big city.
Yeah, yeah.
But we kind of fell in love with Maui when we were over there, and but that's about as close to it as I have gotten.
Yeah, yeah. How do you think your war experience changed or affected your life? Do you feel?
Well, if anything,
or if it even did.
It made me appreciate life for sure, and I am very fortunate in being in a family of long livers. My grandfather lived to be 6 months shy of 100, and my aunt, the only one of my father's family that's left, will, in fact, we're going down 2 weeks from today, is her 99th birthday, and I've always said that I was going to beat him, so I'm well on my way.
Excellent. Oh, very good. Well, as we start to wind down the interview part of this this tape, is there anything that I didn't ask you or that you wanted to talk about now that that we didn't come up in our conversation?
Part of the as we were coming up from Cebu in the Philippines, up in the convoy, and
from Philippines to Japan.
From the Philippines to Japan.
Okay.
As I mentioned, we hit the side of the typhoon that was up there, and after Janice and I were married, her father was in the Navy, and we were talking one day, and something came up about waves being 50 and 60 feet high, and which I always thought, there couldn't be anything that high. And he said, "Scat, where were you then?" And I said, "Well, I was in a convoy right alongside of Hokkaido, heading up, right alongside of Honshu at that time." And he said, "We were in the same convoy."
Is that right?
Yeah. It's funny because Janice's mother and my birthday's the same day, and her father and my father had the same birthday. So, for some reason we were meant to be together.
Yeah, right. Well, I guess as we close down, is there any closing comments you'd like to make? Any words of advice? Any thoughts on what war means to you? Anything? I guess it's an open mic.
Yeah.
I guess
I don't think that war is much different now than it used to be. Of course, the lines were divided. At the time, you pretty much knew where the front line was, but we still had the thing where they talk about suicide bombers. They would send women, for instance, with the satchel charge on their back through the lines and hop in a foxhole and grab hold of you and detonate it. So it's nothing new. It's just on a different scale. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to once again thank you for your participation in this project, but more importantly, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Well, thank you for what you're doing. It's very, very important. Yeah, I didn't describe what the 77th Infantry, the 77th Division was originally a New York division. It was in the First World War as well as the Second World War. The division, or the battalion that I was in the Second World War, was the same as the Lost Battalion in the First World War. Maybe in your history you have heard about that. But hence the Statue of Liberty, that's where we got that. And of course then after the occupation and everything, I was put in the 5th Air Force Division, which is this. And that's about all of that instead of, yeah, this is the combat infantry badge, and then this is all of the Pacific Theater and so forth, and this is a presidential citation. And this was our regimental insignia. And if you notice, I don't know if you can see it, there's a chain across there, and it has one missing link. And that was the Lost Battalion in the First World War. And this, of course, was a Good Conduct Medal, which meant that I was a good boy. And this is the fact that you have an honorable discharge. And that was, they decided to give our outfit a Bronze Star. And this was given after the war was over.
And this is your honorable discharge papers.
Yeah, this is the honorable discharge papers. And the nice part about that is that on the back of it, this is copy, of course, but on the back of it, it gives the full description of your services and all of the awards and so forth that you received. Making a big thing out of it, I guess. The Bronze Star. This was in Sapporo, Hokkaido, and as I said, we had 11 feet and 9 inches of snow up there because it's right at the end of the Aleutian Islands. And that happened to be a Sunday. We were on our way walking down to church. And I wondered when we got over there why all the buildings were two-story. And that's because after it snowed that much, the second story was the only thing you could see. And all of the walkways between the buildings were covered. So instead of being an open covered hallway, it became an enclosed hallway when the snow got over it. Yeah, this is in the Beebi coal mine. This is the superintendent of the mine, and he was a graduate of Washington State University. Yeah, this happens to be in our quarters in Cebu in the Philippines when we ended up having to make our own camp.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the USS Waterbury Victory that brought us home, and there was quite a roar went up when we went under the Golden Gate.
This was your ship, troop ship, returning back to the States. Yeah.
We left about the 8th of September and got back the 18th.